In part 2 of chapter 5 lecture video, I want to start talking about what's included in section 4, which is on skin pigmentation. So this talks about some of the pigments that provides, that's inside of the skin, inside of the epidermis area, that provides some protection against UV radiation, UV light. And one of those pigments is melanin. This is actually produced by a special cell type called a melanocyte. And so in the diagram here, you can kind of see a cross section again of the skin. You see the epidermis up here, down below would be the dermis. And there are some specialized cell types that kind of reside right along that stratum basale region called melanocytes. The melanocytes has a specialized ability to make this pigment. It's a protein-based pigment called melanin. And then it stores it inside of certain containers or vesicles called melanosomes. Once this pigment is produced and stored, you can see this melanocyte kind of has arms or extensions of the cell that kind of stretch out in the upper layers or some of the outer layers here of the epidermis. And it kind of pinches off some of the melanosomes. They kind of come out. And so the other cells, other epithelial cells, start to absorb that melanin from these melanosomes. Now, there are a few other pigments that you find in the skin or in the body. One is keratin, or keratin, and this is a yellowish orangey type pigment that you find in the body that kind of gives the skin a certain color to it, and it does accumulate in the skin, and you actually can use this as a source of a vitamin. Vitamin A, you may have heard of something called retinol, and that contains the pigment keratin. And then hemoglobin is also a pigment, what gives the blood its red color. This is a pigment. It's found in red blood cells, directly in red blood cells, that binds to oxygen, and it also contains an iron molecule that helps in that binding process. And so we'll talk more about hemoglobin when we get to a later chapter. But this hemoglobin allows for the binding of oxygen, transporting oxygen throughout the bloodstream. Now, section 5 begins to talk about some of the accessory structures associated with the integumentary system. And one of those is your hair. Your hair is part of your integument because it's part of what covers and protects the body. And so I've got a few vocabulary words associated with the hair anatomy here. First of all, shaft and root. The shaft is the portion of the hair that protrudes from the outside of the skin. So you see the shaft on the outside, and then the root is any part of the hair that's below the skin surface. If you were to look at a cross-section of a hair, and that's what they've done in the little diagram, they've taken a cross-section of the hair, they looked at it kind of on the side here, and you would see that there's actually layers of the hair, and we'll start kind of in the middle, which is a medulla section. The word medulla refers to middle, and so in the very center, the central axis of the hair, you see the medulla region. Then the majority of the hair is made out of what's called the cortex, and that just means the outer layer. And then you have a protective layer on the outside, and that's called the cuticle. And that helps to protect the hair and protect the inside portion of the hair, and also produces has a kind of an oily nature to it to help the hair as well. Part of the root is what's called the hair follicle, and you see a portion of that in the slide here, the image here. The hair follicle region is what's supporting the root, and there's a couple of parts to the hair follicle. You can see the dermal root sheath and the epithelial root sheath. You basically have a protective layer along the follicle called a root sheath. It's just a covering, and the dermal root sheath is toward the outside. Kind of see the layer on the outside called the dermal root sheath. Then the epithelial root sheath is towards the inside. And then the inner portion of the hair follicle is kind of a wider portion here. You can see the different layers listed here. Again, you've got the middle section, you've got the cortex, and you've got a cuticle on the outside. And all of this represents some living tissue of this hair that's located here in the hair bulb. And that is part of this is a matrix, And that matrix are the living cells that are actively going through mitosis, cell division. So they're dividing, and that's making new hair cells that's coming up and out. Hair grows in cycles, and so there's a series of time periods where the hair is actually actively growing, and then there's a time period where the hair actually rests. And so remember, growth of the hair occurs at that matrix region at the base inside of that hair follicle, and that creates new cells, and the new cells push the old cells out, and that causes the hair to elongate. That happens for a couple of years, and then you have a period of resting for that hair follicle. Not all of the hairs are on the same cycle, so certain hairs may have a resting stage, and then certain hairs are in the growing stage. But during that resting stage, the follicle kind of shortens, condenses a little bit, kind of holds that hair into place. Eventually, when the growing stage resumes, that older hair is kind of released from the follicle, and it comes out, it sheds off, and that makes room for a new hair to grow. One other vocabulary word associated with hair and with the hair follicle is erector pili. This is actually a smooth muscle located in the dermis, and that's attached to the base of the hair follicle. So when that smooth muscle contracts, it causes that hair to bend or to kind of move a little bit and actually stand up on end. Now, there's three terms here associated with hair pigment and hair texture, and the first one is called lanugo. This is the finest type of hair that you have, a very delicate type of a hair. There's no pigment associated with it, and this is what you would find on a developing baby, and even a newborn many times will have a very soft covering of this lanugo on the skin. This is replaced very quickly by something called vellus. This is a pigmented, this can be a pigmented type, but it's mostly unpigmented type of hair, relatively short, relatively fine type of hair. You still see this type of hair maybe on the surface of your skin in certain places, but most of the hair of the body is really called a terminal type of a hair. It's longer than the vellus type hair, it's more coarse, so it's a little denser, and it has pigment. And so the hair usually on your arms or your head or your scalp is going to be this type of terminal type hair. Another type of accessory structure that you find associated with the integumentary system are the nails that you find on your fingernails and your toenails. They are part of your integument. They do allow for protection of the digits of the fingertips and the toes. And so some of the anatomical terms associated with the nails are listed here for you. The nail body, you can kind of see that is what the major portion of the nail is here in the diagram, is referred to as the nail body. It's basically made out of hardened layer of that outer part of epidermis, the epidermal cells that we talked about, called the stratum corneum. It has a lot of keratin in there. This protein is very hard type protein, and that makes a very dense surface to the nail. Any part of the nail that extends into the skin layer beneath the skin is called the nail root. The cuticle of the nail is still part of the stratum corneum, and you can kind of see it here. It's a layer of stratum corneum here that's just above the nail body, and there's a portion known as the hyponychium. This is also part of the stratum corneum, and it's just underneath the free edge. So if you kind of see how the nail grows out and it has a free edge here, just underneath what's attaching the nail body to the underlying epidermis, so it's known as the hyponychium. And then the nail matrix is what is actively growing. So you have cells here that are going through mitosis and cell division. They're actively dividing, and that's creating new cells and pushing the old cells out from the nail bed region. Now, another accessory skin structure we need to talk about, again, are glands. And we've mentioned glands before. Back when we looked at chapter 4 on epithelial tissue, we talked about how glands make up epithelial tissue, some examples. And so now we need to revisit glands, talk about a few examples and a couple of categories here. And so one category of a gland is called an eccrine gland. And it follows that format of merocrine secretion that we've talked about before. And so here is an example. It basically has exocytosis is needed to secrete the product that it's making. So a good example is a sweat gland. And so a sweat gland in the diagram here is an example of an eccrine gland. It is producing a secretion through exocytosis going into the gland duct, and in this case, that sweat gland is leading sweat out to the outside of the body. Sweat is part of your way that the body can release some toxins and some, so it's technically part of your excretion mechanism. It does contain water and some salts. It does contain some metabolic waste products, including ammonia, urea, uric acid, and lactic acid. So it has the ability to get rid of a little bit of waste products, but not very much. Another category of gland is an apocrine gland, and these are only active after puberty. And so the type of gland is a compound type gland. That just means it's branched and it has coils associated with it. These are found around the axilla region or the armpit region, the genitalia, and around the anus you would find apocrine type sweat glands. Another gland type is called a ceruminous gland, and this produces a particular substance called cerumen, which is an oil type gland. And so this is an oil type gland, which is sebum. You find this in the ear canal, and so this is the earwax type gland that's going to produce that sticky substance called cerumen, and this is going to help prevent dirt and insects from penetrating inside of the ear canal. And then we find the last gland type, sebaceous glands. This is a type of holocrine secretion where actual fragments of the cell go into the secretion. And so holocrine type glands or sebaceous glands in this case can either be simple or compound. They can be have branches or not have branches. They could be alveolar in shape or kind of grape-like structure, kind of rounded in shape usually. They produce an oily mixture called sebum, and that oily mixture usually coats the surface of hair. So in this diagram, you see a sebaceous gland is secreting sebum kind of in the hair root area, which will eventually kind of coat the shaft and that cuticle region on the outside. That helps to try to prevent the skin from drying out, and so that sebum will hopefully kind of cover over a little bit of the surface of the skin, try to prevent drying out. That protects the skin from abrasions and kind of cracking and things. And then it has a little bit of antibacterial properties as well to try to inhibit the growth of bacteria. Now the last section we'll look at is talks about a little bit of the pathology of the skin, or what can happen problem-wise to the skin. And so just a couple of vocab words here for you. You can have any kind of wound, which is any type of disruption in the skin's integrity. That could be in the form of a cut or an abrasion or laceration, some type of cut. It could be in the form of a burn. We'll talk about different types of burns, and we'll also talk about different types of skin cancers as well. So let's look at the different types of burns. Most of you are probably familiar with these types of terminologies. So you have what's called a first-degree burn, which is really just a superficial type burn. It is still considered to be a wound. It does damage the surface of the skin, but notice that the damage is really limited to the epidermis, to the outer layer is affected here. The skin usually turns red, and that's called erythema. You have a red appearance. You'll have some pain associated with it, but there's really no permanent damage. The epidermis is able to regenerate pretty easily after a first-degree burn. The second type of burn is called a second-degree burn. This is sometimes referred to as a partial thickness burn because it does affect both the epidermis and maybe part of the dermis, potentially all of the dermis if it's a severe second-degree burn. This does result in a lot of pain. It's getting down into the nervous region, or where the nerve endings are associated with the dermis. It may cause some blistering effects, and it may cause some scarring whenever there's tissue damage that's replaced by scar tissue. The most severe type of burn is a third-degree burn, sometimes referred to as a full-thickness burn, because it may extend through the epidermis, through the dermis, and perhaps even into the hypodermis or the subcutaneous tissue. And it may even damage underlying muscle layer or bone, depending on how severe it is. At first, it's not usually painful at the beginning, because if you damage these layers, you're basically damaging and destroying the nerve tissue that's there. The pain usually comes in when the tissue begins to heal itself and the nerves begin to regenerate. Then a lot of times the person will experience a lot of pain during that tissue repair process. One thing about burns, you can try to estimate the body covering of the burns by what's called the rule of nines. It's just a way to try to estimate how much the body has been affected by a particular burn event. And so what they do is they divide the body into 11 main areas. You can kind of see on the figure here, 11 main areas. Each one kind of comes up with about 9% of the total body area. It's just a way to try to estimate. So for example, if you associate a burn that covers just one arm, then you can estimate that that's about 4.5% of the total body surface structure anyway that's associated with that particular burn. Now the last topic we'll look at is skin cancer. There are three main types of cancers that affect the skin and different layers of the epidermis. And so we'll kind of look at this. All of these are linked to have connections to UV exposure, UV radiation, but there may be other cancer-inducing problems as well, maybe toxins or some type of cancer agent called a carcinogen. This is a chemical or some type of toxin that causes or induces a particular type of cancer, in this case skin cancer, or other forms of radiation that people are exposed to. But these are all linked also to just sunlight, UV radiation as well. So one type of skin cancer affects the basal stratum basale area. The basal, what's called basal cell carcinoma, happens to be the most common type of skin cancer, but really the most common type of all cancers falls into this category. And this is where the cells along the stratum basale area, the keratinocytes along the stratum basale area, the epidermis, those bottom cells, they begin to divide kind of out of control. And for some reason, the UV radiation could potentially cause these cells to affect their cell division or the cell cycle, and they start to divide abnormally there. And so what it kind of looks like is a nodule associated with the epidermis area, and a lot of times it has a cratered-like appearance to it. One thing about basal cell carcinoma is it usually doesn't move to any other tissues. And so it usually doesn't metastasize or move out or migrate to other tissues. And so for that reason, it can usually be resolved by surgery. Another type of skin cancer is known as squamous cell carcinoma. Happens to be the second most common type of skin cancer. And this is affecting the next layer up from the basal layer, the stratum spinosum. These particular cells here begin to divide abnormally. And the cancer cells look, or the actual appearance of it looks very scaly, and they may form like an ulcer type area and actually may bleed from this area. Usually you find these associated around the head and the neck. And so you have a higher chance of these actually metastasizing than you do, or moving out and spreading than you do the basal cell. But usually if these are detected early, then they can still be surgically removed. And then the last thing we want to look at is the malignant melanoma. This is the third type and most severe type of skin cancer. It's very critical to be able to detect melanomas early, because they have a higher tendency to spread or metastasize than the other ones. And that's because this is a cancer of the melanocytes, those melanin producing cells. And if you remember from the earlier figure, those melanocytes have those arms or cell extensions that kind of extend out, and they can perhaps extend down into the dermis. Well, if it reaches the dermis, then there's blood vessels there in the dermis. And if it reaches the blood vessels, that means that part of that cancer cell may break off, get into the bloodstream where it may travel and start to grow in another tissue. These can be treated surgically, but many times there's some type of radiation therapy or chemotherapy required to eliminate that cancer. And so detection is very critical for this, and so there's ways to try to memorize. It's called the ABCDE rule, to try to figure out, what type of cancer, if it truly is the melanoma type of a cancer. A stands for asymmetrical shape. In other words, the shape is not equal. It's not a circle or anything. You have a very irregular type shape. The border is very irregular shaped on a melanoma. The color kind of changes. Usually it's blue-black. You can have a little difference in colors. The diameter gets a little larger than you would find in the other two types of skin cancers. And sometimes you see this skin cancer actually changing shape, so it potentially could evolve and change shape.